welcome to the next 5 minutes, science fiction, the future and the present. When I was asked to contribute to this event and to give a presentation on science fiction, I was initially at a loss as to what angle to take, particularly when I heard that if possible I should talk about how science fiction might have shaped my own activism in communities or politically. And at first I was almost skeptical that it did shape my own approach, but then thinking about it, I found a thread that runs through that I think is worth following. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try and follow that thread and see where it takes us. Now obviously science fiction is an enormous area. It encompasses films, television, books, both literature and pulp, graphic novels, and much, much more. I've always had an interest in the area, a voracious reader and consumer of science fiction, both on television and in written format. I've been to science fiction conventions. I've even found my way to a Star Trek convention on occasion. But my own research area is in the field of visual culture, political and national identity, and material culture. And with that hat on, I've lectured on courses in those areas about the visual language and significations of films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Tarkovsky's Stalker, and so forth. So again, bear with me. What follows is in part personal anecdote, in part drawn from research that I've conducted myself. Of course, a lot depends upon what we mean by science fiction and what do we think of when we hear those words. Do we see images of spaceships? Do we see dystopias, high technology, or no technology? Do we think of class? Do we think of race? Do we think of gender? Is it entertainment or is it something more serious? The American science fiction novelist Ursula K. Le Guin wrote, "Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive." And that's something that I'll return to again and again throughout this presentation. But I want to start formally, in a sense, with a text that Alan McSimone wrote, which Joe Mooney passed on to me, which I think is very important in positioning the thinking behind this presentation. Alan wrote about the American TV series Alien Nation, which was drawn from a 1988 film with James Caan, Mandy Patinkin and Terence Stamp. And in the film, a UFO bearing about 300,000 enslaved aliens crash lands in California. It's set about 1991, perhaps 3 years into the future as it was when the film was made. As Alan said, the latest arrivals to arrive in the land of the free suffer racism and discrimination. A human journalist goes undercover with prosthetics as an alien in order to document the daily discrimination and hatred the aliens have to put up with. He goes missing. A human cop and his alien partner set out to find him. Alan found it a light read with aliens, good guys versus bad guys, and a strong anti-racist theme. He wound up buying the movie, the TV series, all the novels and some of the comics. But he made a point that I think has a broader resonance. He said that the undergraduate for journalist thing references John Howard Griffin's 1961 book Black Like Me. Griffin had his skin temporarily darkened to pass as a black man, and then travelled for 6 weeks through the racially segregated states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas and Georgia to explore life from the other side of the colour line. It was as close as any white person could get to experiencing the racism of the American Deep South, and opened a lot of white American eyes to the everyday reality of what their black neighbours had to deal with. And when I was at national school in Quatermas in the 1970s, one of our teachers used to read excerpts from this to us as a class when we were about 10 or 11 years of age. Alan clearly saw science fiction and this particular fiction as having a progressive content and having something above and beyond entertainment, although he was entertained by it. Now in 1985, I was at a small college not a million miles away from Thomas Street that at the time had an arrangement with Trinity College Dublin, TCD, whereby students where I was could join clubs in TCD. And myself and a friend signed up for the science fiction club, which, speaking of things fantastical, had a small room at the top of one of these buildings on the left on Westland Row. No club where I was at ever had its own rooms, let's put it that way. They had a library of science fiction books which we used to borrow, and one day I started talking to other people there. And already myself active in the community in Kilbarrack and Raheny, I was mystified in my naivety to discover that for the most part, none of them felt that science fiction had a particular progressive or political angle whatsoever. In a sense, it was entertainment. But I'd grown up as they had in the late 1960s and 1970s at a time when science fiction and science fact appeared almost one and the same, where the high technology and the clean antiseptic futures of 2001 or Space 1999 appeared actually more like documentaries than fictions. So how did that come about? How did I buy so completely into this concept of high technology? The late Australian cultural theorist Donald Horne wrote, following on from Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, and his concept of myth, that myth is a belief held in common by a large group of people that gives events and actions a particular meaning. And Donald Horne pointed towards industrialization, or even the concept of high technology or progress built around that as a myth. And it was used to explain societies and the contradictions within them, and so forth. Now, to give you a concrete example of this, consider the Irish context and how modernity and technological progress have been positioned in an Irish context in the 20th century. Take that poster on the left-hand side there. It's from Aer Lingus from the 1950s. It depicts a very Dan Dare-like figure set in an Irish landscape, and there's a high technology of the aeroplane, the gendered aspect of the pilot himself as is, but again representing technology and progress in inverted commas, and then in the background you have a rural idyllic landscape which is a tourist destination. And you've got two separate mythic narratives or stories competing there and actually working together. This lovely rural idyll which people should come to, simultaneously using the high technology of transportation. On the right hand side there's an even more interesting example, I think, which is the Telefís Éireann logo for Irish television in this state when it was introduced in the early 1960s. And if you look at it, it's a combination of two very specific elements. Obviously Telefís Éireann, television, perhaps the most intrusive technology at that time, coming right into the domestic space, but using a symbol, the St. Bridget's cross, a gendered, religious, domestic symbol, familiar and immediately recognisable to everyone in almost every home on the island during that period and long after. And it's used in a sense to badge Telefís Éireann. In one way, it serves as a traditional symbol of the domestic to undercut the modernity of this new medium coming into the domestic sphere. I'll give you another example. Here's a painting, Nights, Candles Burnt Out by Sean Keating, painted in 1929, depicting Ardnacrusha, the hydroelectric works on the Shannon, which was constructed and overseen, by Siemens of Berlin in the 1920s using Irish labour. It's a fascinating painting. It's allegorical. It has a family on the right hand side. There's a priest there reading the Bible by a candle. There's a gunman talking to the capitalist at the centre of the painting, and then there's workers on the left hand side and so forth. There's also an engineer with a lamp. And in the background, of course, is the hydroelectric works. Now, Sean Keating said, the title Nights, Candles Are Burnt Out suggests that the dawn has come when the dim candlelight of surviving medievalism in Ireland is fading before the rising sun of scientific progress, exemplified by the Shannon electricity works, which form the background of my picture. And I think Sean Keating and Donald Horne would have understood each other entirely in terms of concepts like myth and how these concepts function in this sort of context. And for many people who've grown up, like myself, either during or at the tail end of the space race, when the landings on the moon by the United States in 1969 cast a very long cultural shadow, it was only natural there would be some interest, first and foremost, in science, and of course, secondly, in science fiction. This, after all, was the backdrop to our daily lives. Indeed, the cultural shadow of this is so long that housing estates in Dublin to this day have roads named after the astronauts on Apollo 11, Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong. And again, dipping into personal anecdote, completely shamelessly, in 1979, I was in Greendale Community School in Quatermas, and a number of us were asked to paint a mural on the exterior walls, and that's the mural there that you can see in the large image. It had stars and planets. It had on the right-hand side the Liberator, the spaceship from the BBC dystopian TV series Blake 7, and in the centre, designed by my friend Mark, is the astronaut, which is taken directly from the photograph we just saw on the previous slide. The point is that this was not seen as unusual in the context of Ireland in the late 1970s. The mythic hold of the idea of high technology, of the space race, permeated into Kilbarrack and was seen in a sense as almost the natural order of things. And by the way, the inset there is from much more recently, I think about 5 years ago, and the mural still exists, at least in part, and has retained its integrity to this point. So this, in other words, the space race had a hegemonic hold on the public imagination, and the aspects of the space race became conceptual and visual shorthand. The space shuttle, Soviet spacecraft, later Russian spacecraft, radio telescopes, and so forth. And we see this, of course, in science fiction. John Mills starred in Quatermas, a 1979 TV series on ITV, or Thames actually as was, and the last of 4 series featuring Quatermas, the person Quatermas, a scientist, which had been shown on the BBC initially from the 1950s onwards. It depicts a future which is in collapse, a Britain and a world which is in collapse from social discord. Large numbers of young people are joining a cult called the Planet People. They're gathering at places like Stonehenge and other prehistoric sites in the belief that they'll be taken away to a better place and a different planet. And it rapidly transpires that their hopes are very much misplaced, and that in fact they're being harvested rather than transported. The series takes the mythic signification and meaning of the space shuttle, and rather than show it as the pinnacle of high technology, it does exactly the opposite. It has it brushed aside and destroyed by an alien intelligence so powerful and remote, the series suggests it doesn't even notice the spaceship as a spaceship, or doesn't care if it does. And in the first 20 minutes of the first episode, a joint USSR space station is destroyed on screen. The space age has turned sour in the face of forces that simply do not care about humans. And this trope of high technology and technological vulnerability is replayed time and again in science fiction during this period and long after, right to the present day. The space shuttle, for instance, in James Bond's Moonraker in 1979, is dispatched, and right the way through to the Sandra Bullock film Gravity, which is much more recent, where again in the first 10 minutes a space shuttle is destroyed. And the shuttle itself is representative of a phase of the space age that has passed. Nothing as elaborate is now used or planned to bring humans to Earth orbit for many, many years to come. And having 2 real-life disasters where orbiters were lost, one in the 1980s and the other in the 2000s, some of these fictions seem almost prescient. Quatermass itself, as I said, has societal collapse, it has militarized police, it has military curfews, it has political gangs in urban contexts fighting between each other. And yet, in amongst that, there is a sense that scientific technology, progress, knowledge, and rationality are the only way forward, that that's the way the world will be saved. So I think that's a key point as well. Nigel Neal, who wrote Quatermass, all 4 series, said, Quatermass is a story of the future, but perhaps only a few years from now. There are some clues already in the most obvious places, the streets. Pavements littered with rubbish, walls painted with angry graffiti, Belfast black with smoke and rage. Worst of all, the mindless violence. And his pessimistic vision of the future, of course, was in some ways a pessimistic vision of the then present. This is from the Belfast Archive Project from the 1970s, a photograph taken from Belfast. 10 years prior to Quatermass, 12 actually, 1966, Fahrenheit 451, based on the novel by Ray Bradbury and filmed by Francois Truffaut, was released. Truffaut said, "It is not the sort of thing that interests me, science fiction, or indeed the book, Fahrenheit 451. I usually make films from books I admire. This was different. One day when I was having a conversation with a friend about science fiction, which I told him I didn't like because it was too far from reality, too arbitrary in its events. In rebuttal, my friend told me the plot of the book Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, describing a society in which books were forbidden, in which firemen did not put out fires but set them in order to burn books, in which men who wanted to read were forced to commit the text to memory. When I heard all this, I instantly decided to make the film, but had not actually read the novel. And the book itself is highly political. At that time, Bradbury, when he wrote it, was a Democrat, and there were allusions to allegory about the McCarthy period in the United States, again, all of which passed Truffaut by. The film itself has many of the tropes of science fiction. There are monorails. It sets somewhat into the future, not terribly far. Indeed, it's a very recognizable future. The blank concrete walls, it's somewhat dehumanized. Cyril Cusack is in there, and so forth. This is a future based around the present. The Elton housing estate in Roehampton in Britain, built in 1958 and considered at the time the pinnacle of social housing, was used as one of the main locations, and there are suburban streets in the film and so forth. One aspect of the film that was very notable was, and logically enough, in a world where people don't read, were very large TV screens. In the novel, they're wall to ceiling in what is called a TV parlour. In a film, a little smaller, as can be seen here. And I think it's worth noting that the film is very gendered in some respects, with women in particular being seen as part of this domestic sphere and uncritically taking up, or seemingly uncritically, although there are twists in it, accepting what is beamed into this domestic sphere. And again, in a world of flat screens, this perhaps looks, if not small, well, not as huge as it did in the 1960s, but it certainly looked pretty impressive back then. The British novelist J.G. Ballard wrote the novel Highrise in the early 1970s. It describes the disintegration of a luxury block of apartments, a very high-rise building, where the residents therein rapidly lapse into chaos and violence and so forth. It's a bleak novel. It's quite a short novel as well, worth reading. But one of the aspects that's most interesting about it is Ballard wrote that it is set in the next 5 minutes, and it is set in an inner space, an imaginary realm in which on the one hand the outer world of reality and on the other the inner world of mind meet and merge. Of course, it wasn't that unusual to any of us growing up again in the 1970s. Here are the flats at Swan's Nest, Kilbarrack, built in 1971 and demolished in 2000, of course. There were corporation flats all over Dublin during the same period, and even before. This sense of the high-rise building as being part and parcel of progress and modernity was central in a sense, I think, and it was part and parcel of the backdrop of our lives. There's an inset there which shows Barfield Grove in the foreground rather, and Swan's Nest Court in the background. It's actually seen from Roddy Dawes' van in 1996. But one of the interesting aspects of Ballard's fiction is that it is not about social housing. It is in actual fact about private housing and apartments and so forth. And of course, as we know, we now live in a world where there's ever more of that and much less social housing. And I think it's fascinating that in some ways Ballard positioned his fiction within a class context which was perhaps somewhat unexpected. And of course, Ballard was all about what was happening inside the mind and the psychology of human beings set within the context of modernity. But that's an interesting angle to take as well. Now finally, in terms of films that I'm going to address, we have 2006 Children of Men, set 21 years in the future. 21 years in the future, where 2 decades of human infertility have left society globally on the brink of collapse. No child has been born for 18 years. The film offers a ray of hope, let's put it no more than that, for anyone who hasn't seen it. But it's an interesting film. It's also, I would say it's quite a gendered film, although there's a female character at the heart of it, and quite a number of female characters. But I have read it as regarded as an essentially feminist film, so that's an interesting aspect. It's based on a novel by the crime writer P.D. James, which was quite unlike the rest of the material that she wrote. I'll come back to that in a moment. Its depiction of the society under collapse in Britain being one of the last remaining nation states that's still extant and surviving the broader social dislocation, is particularly good, but it's very familiar to those of us who have seen Quatermas. Asylum seekers seek sanctuary in what remains of Britain, but are imprisoned. There's paramilitary policing again. Some of the elites live in relatively fine style, high above everyone else. And Alfonso Cuarón, the director, said, "Children of Men, more than anything, was an essay, a diagnosis of the state of things at the time it was made. It was so obviously already then, but it needed to be so gruesomely obvious before the media would notice." Mark Fisher, the cultural theorist, wrote, "What is unique about the dystopian Children of Men is that it is specific to late capitalism. For all that we know, the authoritarian measures that are everywhere in place could have been implemented within a political structure that remains notionally democratic. The war on terror has prepared us for such a development." Of course, it depends where you posit capitalism starting. Interestingly, for P.D. James, who wrote the original novel, the question at the heart of the book was much more simple. If there were no future, how would we behave? Now, she herself was a Conservative peer in the British House of Lords, a deeply religious Anglican, and in a sense this for her was a question of ethics and morality, but I think it's also fundamentally a science fiction question. And this tells us something about both interpretation and intent, that whatever the goals of a work of fiction, it will be interpreted and reinterpreted, and perhaps misinterpreted, by those who refashion or analyse it subsequently. Margaret Atwood, author of one of the great dystopian novels, later a film and more recently a TV series, of course, that being The Handmaid's Tale, has written that she is not a prophet. Let's get rid of that idea right now. Prophecies are really about now. In science fiction, it's always about now. What else could it be about? There is no future. There are many possibilities, but we do not know which one we are going to have. And I guess if after all this, it seems that science fiction seems to be heavily inflected by the present, by that 5 minutes into the future, and perhaps some will argue that I've left out the spaceships and the aliens, though they're all in there, Quatermas, Alien Nation, and indeed all the stuff of science fiction is there. Of course, this is a partial reading. But consider how strange this event here is today. Usually we'll be gathered in the Sean O'Casey Centre at the heart of East Wall, a building that by its own intrinsic modernism is visually starkly contrast with the terrace houses and other buildings around it. And yet its modernism is softened by the circular windows and the pastel colours on the exterior. And why aren't we there? Unfortunately, due to a very grim reality, that most science fiction concepts, a global pandemic, and instead we are, I hope some of us are anyway, watching this on televisions, computers in our homes, or perhaps places of work, or that most science fiction of concepts, the mobile device, using technologies that even 20 years ago might have seemed improbable or implausible. So it's all around us, the future, and we'll continue moving that 5, 10, 15 minutes into it. And the stuff of spaceships and social change and societal collapse and utopias and dystopias fundamentally are, I think, as Atwood has said, and Ursula K. Le Guin before, addressing the questions of the day. And yes, I think in that way, science fiction is a fiction of the progressive. It's a questioning, critiquing sort of fiction. And I'd say certainly my engagement with community from the 1980s on was definitely driven in part by this backdrop that I had seen, and that sense that the 5 minutes into the future didn't have to be worse, that it could actually be better. Thanks very much.